The brochure was tucked under a cushion on the living room sofa, a place I rarely sat. It was glossy, cheap, and horrifying. Golden Sunset Meadows, it chirped, with a picture of a sterile, low-slung building that looked more like a 1970s motel that had given up. The smiling seniors on the cover had the vacant, desperate look of people who were paid to be there, not people who lived there. I opened it. The list of amenities included bingo twice a week and scheduled trips to a local, cut-rate grocery store. The fine print at the bottom mentioned a non-refundable community fee and a monthly rate that would systematically drain my savings, leaving just enough for the state to pick up the tab when the money ran out. It was a place to be sent to be forgotten. Later that evening, I heard my daughter Sarah talking to her husband Tom in the kitchen. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. "He's just getting so forgetful, Tommy," she said, a manufactured sigh in her voice. "He almost left the stove on again last week. I worry constantly. This place in Oakhaven is secure. It's for the best." I hadn't almost left the stove on. I had been simmering a pot of soup, and she had walked in and turned it off, claiming she smelled gas. She was building a narrative, brick by insidious brick. "My name is Arthur Jennings. I am 68 years old, and for 42 years, I was a civil engineer. I designed bridges, structures meant to withstand immense stress, to carry people safely from one solid point to another. I understand foundations. I know what it takes to build something that lasts, and I know that the most catastrophic failures often begin with the smallest, most invisible cracks in the base." The house they were standing in, the one I had shared with my late wife Helen for 4 decades, was my foundation, and I was beginning to realize it was being systematically undermined. Helen had always doted on Sarah, our only child. "This beautiful house will be yours one day, sweetheart," she'd say, stroking Sarah's hair. "You'll raise your own children here." Helen was a romantic, a woman who operated on love and promises. I operated on blueprints, legal deeds, and load-bearing calculations. When Helen passed 2 years ago, the house, which we jointly owned, became mine, and mine alone. It was a legal fact, a detail recorded in the county clerk's office, as solid and unambiguous as the concrete pilings of the Harrison Bridge downtown. Sarah, it seemed, had chosen to remember her mother's sentiment and ignore the legal reality. She and Tom had moved in 6 months after the funeral, ostensibly to help me out and keep the big house from feeling so empty. Now I saw it for what it was, an occupation. They had established a beachhead in the guest rooms and were now planning a coup to seize the entire territory. They saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle, a stubborn old man sitting on their inheritance. That brochure wasn't a suggestion, it was a battle plan, and the conversation in the kitchen was a declaration of war. What they didn't know, what they had so arrogantly overlooked, was that I am a man who prepares for contingencies. An engineer always considers the worst-case scenario: earthquakes, 100-year floods, material fatigue. Betrayal from your own child was just another form of stress test, and I would not fail it. I calmly walked back to my study, the brochure folded neatly in my pocket, and closed the door. The foundation of our family was fractured, perhaps beyond repair, but my foundation, the one I had built for myself over a lifetime of careful work and prudent planning, was still intact, and I would be damned if I let them demolish it. They had underestimated me. They saw an old man. They forgot I was the man who built the bridges they drive over every single day. They had started this. I would finish it. My first move was one of feigned acquiescence. The next morning at breakfast I mentioned that I was feeling a bit tired lately. I let my hand tremble slightly as I poured my coffee. I forgot where I'd left my reading glasses, letting Sarah find them for me on top of my head with a condescendingly sweet, "Oh, Dad." Each act of manufactured frailty was a small piece of camouflage, allowing me to move undetected behind enemy lines. They bought it completely. Their relief was palpable. It softened the edges of their faces, made their voices gentler. They thought their path was being cleared. In reality, they were walking directly into the trap I was beginning to design. My study became my command center. For 40 years, it had been a place of schematics and calculations. Now it was repurposed for a different kind of project. The first step in any project is discovery. You must know the terrain. I spent a full day going through my files, pulling out the deed to the house, my mortgage statements, long since paid off, my investment portfolio, my will, and the power of attorney documents. I had a durable power of attorney made out to Sarah, but it was revocable, and crucially, It had not yet been activated by a declaration of my incapacity from two separate physicians. That was their next likely move, I surmised. They'd find some pliable doctor to say I was no longer competent. I scanned every document onto a secure encrypted hard drive, then created a second backup that I stored in my safe deposit box at the bank. I needed my own expert counsel, an ally. I didn't call the family lawyer who had drafted our wills. He had known Sarah since she was a girl and might be susceptible to her manipulations. I needed someone with no emotional connection to the situation. I found him online, a man named David Chen, a specialist in estate litigation and elder law. His website was professional. His testimonial spoke of a calm, incisive approach. He was a younger man, maybe late 30s, which I preferred. He would be hungry and unburdened by old-school sentimentality. I booked a consultation. Before I met with him, I conducted further surveillance. It felt distasteful, monitoring my own daughter, but engineering teaches you that you cannot base a critical project on assumptions. You need hard data. I purchased a few small, voice-activated audio recorders. Legally, in our state, I could record any conversation that took place in my own home. In common areas where there was no reasonable expectation of privacy. I placed one under the kitchen table and another behind a bookshelf in the living room. The recordings were illuminating and sickening. It was worse than I thought. They weren't just planning to move me. They were actively spending my money before they even had it. Once he's at Golden Sunset, we can sell the house immediately, Tom said, his voice greasy with greed. Carol from my office says we could get at least $900,000 in this market. Maybe more if we stage it right, Sarah chimed in. And with my power of attorney, I can liquidate his stock portfolio. He's got a ton in those blue chip funds. We could finally pay off my student loans, your truck, and have enough for a real down payment on that place at the lake. They talked about my possessions, my life's work, as if it were a catalog they were flipping through. They debated selling my collection of antique surveying equipment, my first edition engineering textbooks. They were vultures, not just waiting for me to die, but actively trying to hurry along the process of my social and financial demise. They had a timeline. They mentioned an appointment with a Dr. Evans in 3 weeks. A name I didn't recognize. This was clearly their hand-picked physician, the one they would use to try and declare me incompetent. The clock was ticking. I transcribed the most damning parts of the recordings, labeling them by date and time. This was my evidence, the foundational bedrock of my counter-offensive. When I walked into David Chen's office a few days later, I didn't present as a sad, doddering old man. I presented as an engineer with a problem. I laid out the situation calmly and factually. I presented the Golden Sunset Meadows brochure, the transcripts of the recordings, and a summary of my financial assets. I was organized. I had a spreadsheet. David listened intently, his expression unreadable at first. He reviewed the documents, his eyes sharp and focused. When I was finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Jennings," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice, "they have made a critical error. They believe you are the project, when in fact, you are the project manager." David Chen was precisely the ally I needed. He was methodical, legally sharp, and possessed a quiet, reassuring confidence. Our first meeting felt less like a client consultation, and more like a project kickoff. He confirmed my understanding of the legal landscape. The house was mine, free and clear. The durable power of attorney was a threat, but one we could neutralize. The recordings, while distressing, were my ace in the hole. "The key here, Arthur," David said, leaning forward, "is to let them continue to operate on their flawed assumptions. Let them think they're in control. We won't react to their plan. We'll execute our own, making theirs irrelevant." This was language I understood perfectly. We weren't going to build a better defense. We were going to build a completely different structure on a more solid foundation. Our first action was to address the power of attorney. David drafted a document immediately and had it notarized, a full and immediate revocation of the durable power of attorney previously granted to Sarah. He didn't file it with my financial institutions yet. That was a card to be played at the right moment. For now, it sat in his safe, a silent torpedo waiting for its target. "They can't use a key that no longer fits the lock," David explained. Next, we addressed the will. My original will left the bulk of my estate, including the house, to Sarah. It was a document born of love and tradition, from a time when I couldn't conceive of the current situation. "Time for an update," I said, a grim sense of finality in my voice. We spent the afternoon restructuring my final wishes. I set up a charitable trust in Mayim and Helen's name, dedicated to funding scholarships for promising engineering students at the local university. It was a fitting legacy, building futures instead of funding a lake house. I allocated a small token amount to Sarah, enough to prevent her from successfully contesting the will on the grounds of being forgotten, but small enough to be a stinging final rebuke. David suggested the exact amount. Enough for a high-end refrigerator, but not enough for a new car, he'd said with a thin smile. The bulk of my remaining liquid assets I placed into a living trust with a new corporate trustee. I was the beneficiary during my lifetime, and the trust would be dissolved and distributed to the scholarship fund upon my death. My financial future was now a fortress, and Sarah no longer held any keys. The final and most crucial part of the plan was the house itself. You have every right to sell your property, Arthur, David stated plainly. It is the cleanest and most decisive way to end this. It removes the prize they are fighting for. This was the step that gave me a moment's pause. Selling the house, it felt like severing the last physical tie to Helen, to the life we had built, the garden we planted, the doorway where we measured Sarah's height. But then I thought of the conversations in the kitchen, the Golden Sunset Meadows brochure. They had already desecrated the memories in this house with their greed. Selling it wasn't an act of abandonment, it was an act of preservation, protecting the home's legacy from those who would tarnish it. I agreed. The plan was set. David connected me with a real estate agent he trusted, a woman named Carol Martinez, who was known for her discretion and efficiency. I now had my project team, David for legal, Carol for sales, and me as the project manager. While all this was happening in the background, I maintained my facade at home. I became even more helpless. I'd ask Sarah to read my mail for me, claiming the print was too small. I'd let Tom help me with online banking, all the while using a dummy account with a trivial balance. They were smug, confident. Their pity for me was a thick, suffocating blanket. They had no idea I was watching them from a place of cold, clear-eyed strategy. One afternoon, Sarah mentioned their upcoming trip. Tom and I are going to the coast for a long weekend, she announced. His company has a condo there. It'll be a nice break. You'll be okay here alone for a few days, right, Dad? Oh, I think so, I said, looking up from my newspaper with what I hoped was a vacant expression. I'll just putter around. Don't you worry about me. It was the opening I had been waiting for. A 3-day window. In project management, this is called the critical path. It was the sequence of tasks that determined the minimum time for the project's completion. Their vacation was my critical path. The moment they pulled out of the driveway, my project would go live. The hum of their SUV's engine fading down the street was the starting gun. I gave them a full hour's head start. Then I walked to the hall closet and pulled out a box. It wasn't full of memories or old photographs. It contained a set of new, high-security locks for every exterior door of the house. I am not a locksmith, but an engineer understands mechanics. Within 2 hours, every lock was changed. The old keys, the ones Sarah and Tom had on their keychains, were now just useless pieces of metal. That was step 1. Secure the perimeter. Step 2 was activating my agent. I called Carol Martinez. They're gone, Carol, I said. The site is clear. I'm on my way, she replied. She was a whirlwind of professional energy, arriving with a photographer and a stager in tow. She walked through the house with a keen eye, not seeing a home filled with memories, but a product to be sold. We need to depersonalize, she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. Buyers need to be able to picture themselves here. For the rest of the day we worked. I thought it would be painful, packing away the evidence of my life with Helen, but it was strangely liberating. We took down our family photos, the ones of Sarah as a smiling child, blissfully unaware of the person she would become. We boxed up Helen's collection of porcelain birds, the stager, a young woman with a flair for minimalism, rearranged furniture, brought in neutral art, and placed decorative towels in the bathrooms. By the end of the day, the house felt less like my home, and more like an elegant, anonymous hotel suite. It was scrubbed clean of my personality, ready for a new owner. The photographer took stunning pictures, the wide-angle lens making the rooms look even more spacious and bright. Carol worked on her laptop at the dining room table, drafting the listing description. She used words like immaculate, pride of ownership, and ready for its next chapter. Every word felt both true and like a small, sharp jab at my daughter's expectations. While they were busy, I focused on my own tasks. I undertook a few minor repairs I had been putting off, a dripping faucet in the guest bath, a loose railing on the back deck, My hands, which I had pretended were frail and trembling, were steady and capable. I felt a surge of my old self, the man who could solve problems with his mind and his hands. It felt good. I also took the opportunity to sweep for any listening devices they might have planted. I didn't find any, which confirmed my assessment of their arrogance. They didn't think they needed to spy on me. They thought they knew exactly what I was thinking. That evening, after Carol and her team had left, the house was silent and strange. It was immaculate, beautiful, and utterly foreign. It was no longer my home. It was an asset, a commodity. The emotional detachment was a necessary part of the process. The next day Carol called. "The listing is live, Arthur, and I've already got 3 showing requests for Monday morning." Monday, the day Sarah and Tom were due back. "Perfect," I said. "Let's schedule them. The more, the better." The final piece of the puzzle was the most visible. On Sunday afternoon, just as the weekend was winding down, a small truck pulled up to the curb. A man got out and efficiently hammered a sign into the center of my front lawn. It was a handsome sign, in the real estate agency's colors of navy and gold. On it, in large, clear letters, were 2 words that would change everything: "For sale." I stood at the window of my now impersonal living room and looked at it. It was a declaration, a final, unavoidable statement of fact. They couldn't ignore it. They couldn't spin it. It was the culmination of my quiet planning, now made public. The foundation of their greedy little dream had just been dynamited, and all I had to do now was wait for them to come home and see it. They were due back around 3 in the afternoon on Monday. Carol had strategically scheduled the first showing for 2:30. A lovely young couple, first-time home buyers, were already there with their agent when Sarah's SUV turned onto our street. I was watching from the upstairs study window, which had a clear view of the road. I saw the moment Sarah noticed the sign. The vehicle, which had been cruising along at a relaxed pace, braked so abruptly that the nose dipped forward. It sat there in the middle of the street for a full 10 seconds before lurching into the driveway, stopping mere inches from the garage door. I didn't go down to meet them. I simply remained in the study, a silent observer in my own home. I heard the car doors slam. I heard Sarah's key scraping uselessly in the new lock of the front door. The frantic, repeated scratching sound was deeply satisfying. Then came the pounding, a loud, furious banging that was a stark contrast to the polite rap of the real estate agent's clients just moments before. "Dad, Dad, what the hell is this? Open the door." Her voice was shrill, laced with a panic I had never heard before. Tom was shouting too, something about a joke, that this had to be some kind of sick joke. I let them bang for another minute before I calmly walked down the stairs. I opened the door. Sarah's face was a mask of disbelief and rage, her complexion blotchy. Tom stood behind her, his jaw slack. "Sarah, Tom, you're back," I said, my voice even and calm. "You have some things on the porch." I gestured to the neatly packed boxes containing their belongings from the guest rooms. "What is this?" Sarah shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the "for sale" sign. "What have you done?" "I'm selling my house," I replied simply. "There are some prospective buyers here right now, so if you could please keep your voices down, I'd appreciate it." The young couple and their agent were standing awkwardly in the entryway, trying to pretend they weren't witnessing a full-blown family meltdown. The agent, a pro, tried to salvage the situation. "Perhaps we could start with the upstairs bedrooms," she suggested, attempting to herd her clients away from the unfolding drama. Tom finally found his voice. "You can't do this, Arthur. This house is for Sarah. Helen promised." "Helen is gone, Tom," I said, my voice hardening just enough to cut through their hysteria. "And her sentiments, while lovely, are not legally binding. The deed to this house is in my name and mine alone. I am the owner, and I am selling it." Sarah pushed past me into the house, her eyes wild. She looked at the staged living room, the missing photos, the generic art. "Where are our things? Where are Mom's things? Our family photos, and your mother's personal effects, are safely in storage," I told her. "Your belongings are on the front porch." It was then that she noticed the prospective buyers. The full humiliation of the situation seemed to crash down on her. She wasn't the lady of the manor, graciously welcoming people into her future home. She was an intruder in a stranger's house, a house that was being sold right out from under her. "You need to leave," she snarled at the young couple. "This is a mistake. This house is not for sale." Carol Martinez, who had been alerted to the commotion, stepped forward. Her presence was formidable. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside. You are disrupting a scheduled showing of my client's property." "Your client?" Sarah scoffed. A raw, ugly sound. He's my father. He's not well. He doesn't know what he's doing. This was it. The moment I had prepared for. On the contrary, Sarah, I said, my voice carrying through the entryway. I have never known with more clarity what I am doing. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It was a copy of the Golden Sunset Meadows brochure. I believe this is yours. I found it in the sofa. Sarah's face went white. She stared at the glossy paper as if it were a venomous snake. Tom's blustering facade crumbled, replaced by a pasty, guilty pallor. And I have been enjoying the acoustics in this house. I continued, my gaze steady. They're quite remarkable. You can hear conversations from the kitchen, all the way in the living room. Conversations about my stock portfolio, my supposed incompetence, and your appointment with a Dr. Evans. I let the words hang in the air. The silence was absolute, broken only by the quiet intake of breath from Carol's clients. The game was over. The board was cleared. Sarah and Tom stood there, exposed and defeated, not by an emotional outburst or a shouting match, but by a calm, factual recitation of their own treachery. They had no response. There was nothing left to say. They had been so certain of my weakness, so confident in their plan, that they had never once considered I might have a plan of my own. The confrontation drained all the fight out of them. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled not with remorse, but with the hollow look of someone whose calculations had all been proven wrong. Tom just stared at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. There was no grand apology, no sudden realization of their cruelty. There was only the quiet, pathetic fizzle of their greed being extinguished. Carol Martinez, ever the professional, gently but firmly escorted them to the door. I think it's time for you to collect your boxes and leave, she said. They went without another word. A pair of defeated conspirators, their grand heist foiled. They loaded their things into their SUV in a tense, furious silence and drove away. I didn't watch them go. I turned my attention back to the prospective buyers. I do apologize for the interruption, I said to the young couple, who looked like they'd just been through a war. Would you like to continue the tour? To their credit, and perhaps out of sheer morbid curiosity, they did, and they ended up loving the house. They made an offer that very evening, for $10,000 over the asking price. It was a clean offer, no contingencies. I accepted it immediately. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity that felt like the final, efficient stages of a long-planned project. David Chen handled the legal side, fielding a single desperate call from a lawyer Sarah had hired. David calmly informed him of the evidence I possessed, the recordings, the brochure, the notarized revocation of the power of attorney. He explained that any attempt to contest the sale, or my competency, would result in that evidence becoming part of a public court record. The lawyer, presumably after a panicked conversation with Sarah, never called back. While the sale was in escrow, I focused on my own exit strategy. I was not going to a Golden Sunset Meadows. I was going to a place of my own choosing. I found a modern 2-bedroom condo in a new development on the other side of town. It had a gym, a pool, and a view of the river, not a parking lot. It was clean, secure, and entirely my own. It was a place for living, not a place for waiting to die. I hired movers to transport the few pieces of furniture I wanted to keep, and the boxes of Helen's things and our family photos, which I would go through on my own time. Everything else, the heavy dining set Sarah had coveted, the massive sectional sofa Tom loved to lounge on, was sold in an estate sale. The proceeds I donated to the engineering scholarship fund I had established. It felt like a cleansing. Every object they had mentally claimed for themselves was converted into a force for good, for building something new. I signed the final closing documents at David's office. He handed me the check from the sale, a staggering amount of money that represented 40 years of hard work, smart investments, and careful stewardship. It felt less like a windfall and more like a reclamation. It was the physical manifestation of my independence. So what's next for you, Arthur? David asked as he walked me out. A project manager is never without a project, I said with a smile. My first one is to learn how to use the ridiculously complicated espresso machine that came with my new condo. After that, I'm thinking of taking a trip. There's a famous bridge in France, the Millau Viaduct. I've always wanted to see it. He shook my hand. You've earned it, he said. You really have. I never heard from Sarah or Tom directly again. I heard through the grapevine, the way you always do in a family, even a fractured one, that they had been forced to rent a small apartment in a less than desirable part of town. Their plan had been predicated on a massive, immediate infusion of cash from my assets. Without it, their own finances, which I now suspect were a house of cards, had collapsed. There was a certain situational irony to it that I couldn't help but appreciate. They had tried to make me homeless, only to find themselves scrambling for a roof over their own heads. Their underestimation of me was their undoing. They saw an old man, a relic to be managed. They failed to see the engineer, the planner, the man who spent a lifetime ensuring his structures could withstand the greatest of pressures. Moving into my new condo was like taking the first breath of clean air after being in a stuffy, contaminated room for far too long. The space was smaller, yes, but it felt infinitely larger. It was unburdened by the weight of toxic expectations and the ghosts of a relationship that had soured beyond recognition. The walls were bare, the rooms echoed slightly, and it was the most peaceful sound I had ever heard. This was a blank slate, a new schematic waiting for a design. I spent the first week methodically setting up my new life. I unpacked my books, arranging my old engineering texts on a new modern shelf. They looked less like relics, and more like the foundational knowledge upon which my new life was being built. I put up a few pictures, one of Helen and me on our wedding day, another of the Harrison Bridge at sunset, its steel girders silhouetted against the sky. I left the pictures of Sarah, as a child, in a box. I wasn't ready to look at them yet, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The espresso machine was, as predicted, a complex piece of German engineering. But I downloaded the manual, read it twice, and by the third day, I was making a perfect cappuccino. It was a small, silly victory, but it mattered. It was proof that I was still capable of learning, of mastering new systems. I established a new routine. Mornings were for the gym downstairs, or a long walk along the river. Afternoons were for reading, for managing my now consolidated investments online, and for planning my trip to France. I felt my mind, which had been dulled by the oppressive atmosphere of the old house, sharpening again. I was engaged, I was active, I was the sole director of my own life. There was no one to question my decisions, no one to sigh with manufactured concern if I decided to have a glass of whiskey in the evening. There was only freedom. I did have one visitor from my old life. My cousin Mark, who had always been more of a brother to me, came by. He had heard the story in bits and pieces and wanted to hear it from me. I told him everything, from the brochure to the sale. He listened, shaking his head slowly. "I never liked the way she treated you after Helen passed," he said. "Like you were a piece of furniture that came with the house." His validation was comforting. "But selling the place, Arthur, that was a master stroke." "It wasn't about revenge, Mark," I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it. It was about survival. It was a controlled demolition. I had to clear the site before I could build something new. He understood. We sat on my new balcony, looking out at the river as boats slid by. The conversation was easy, comfortable. It was a reminder that while one crucial family bond had been irrevocably broken, others remained. The scholarship fund was another source of quiet satisfaction. I received a letter from the university's foundation, formally thanking me for the endowment. They told me the first Helen and Arthur Jennings engineering scholarship would be awarded in the fall semester. The idea of my money, the money Sarah and Tom had tried to steal to fund a life of leisure, instead being used to help a bright, hard-working student build a future in a field I loved, was a form of justice far more profound than any personal victory. It was a legacy of construction, over destruction. I finally felt detached enough to deal with the last box of memories. I went through the photos of Sarah. There she was, on my shoulders at a picnic, holding my hand on her first day of school, beaming in her graduation gown. I felt a pang of loss, not for the woman she had become, but for the daughter she used to be. I saw now that the cracks in our foundation had been there for years, small fissures of entitlement and a lack of genuine empathy I had chosen to ignore, papering them over with a father's love. It was a painful lesson in structural analysis. I packed the photos away again, but this time, it wasn't with anger. It was with a sense of closure, of acknowledging a part of my life that was over. The design had been flawed. The structure had failed. It was time to move on. The trip to France was the capstone on my new life's foundation. Standing on an overlook, gazing at the Millau Viaduct as it soared over the Tarn Valley, was a profoundly moving experience. It was a marvel of modern engineering, elegant, impossibly light, yet strong enough to withstand the fierce winds of the region. It was a testament to what humanity could achieve with vision, precision, and an unwavering respect for the laws of physics. It represented everything I had ever valued in my professional life. It was a bridge. It connected 2 points, spanning a vast emptiness, making a journey possible that was once daunting. In a way, I had built my own bridge over the last few months. I had spanned the chasm of betrayal and grief to get to a new, stable place. I spent 2 weeks exploring the French countryside, enjoying the food, the wine, and the anonymity. I was just another tourist, a man with a camera and a guidebook. No one knew me as the father who was nearly cast aside, the old man who outsmarted his greedy daughter. I was just Arthur. It was a liberating feeling. The quiet confidence I had rediscovered during the execution of my plan solidified into a deep and abiding sense of peace. When I returned to my condo, it felt like coming home. The sterile newness had been replaced by the comfortable patina of my own presence. I had made it mine. I received another letter from the university. They had selected the first recipient of the Jennings Scholarship, a young woman from a small town who was the first in her family to attend college. They included a short biography. Her essay was about her fascination with how Roman aqueducts were built, and how she wanted to design infrastructure for developing nations. I read it and felt a connection to her, this stranger I would likely never meet. My legacy was secure. It was in her future, not in a house full of resentful memories. One afternoon, a few months later, I was walking by the river when I saw a familiar SUV drive past. Sarah was at the wheel, Tom in the passenger seat. They didn't see me. They both looked tired, worn down. The sheen of arrogance was gone, replaced by the dull finish of disappointment. I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, not even pity. It was like watching a car I used to own drive by with a new owner. It was a part of my past, and it no longer had any power over me. They had become irrelevant to my life, and that was the ultimate victory. My life now is quiet, but it is not small. It is filled with purpose of my own making. I manage my investments. I volunteer twice a week at the local library's adult literacy program, and I am planning my next trip, this time to see the aqueducts in Spain. I have friends, I have my health, and I have my freedom. I learned a hard lesson in the most personal way imaginable, that the most important structures we build are not made of steel and concrete, but of trust and integrity. And when the foundation of trust is destroyed, you cannot patch it. You must have the courage to condemn the old structure, clear the site completely, and start building anew on solid ground. My name is Arthur Jennings. I am 69 years old, and for the first time in a long time, I am looking forward, not back. The bridge to my future is sound. My new life settled into a comfortable rhythm, a well-designed system operating at peak efficiency. The daily walks, the volunteering, the quiet afternoons with a book and a perfect espresso, they became the rituals that defined my independence. I realized that for years my life had been structured around the needs and expectations of others, first as a husband and provider, which was a role I cherished, and then as a father, and finally as the caretaker of a house that had become more of a museum than a home. Now my only obligation was to myself. It was an unfamiliar concept at first, but one I grew to embrace. I reconnected with old friends from my engineering firm, men I had lost touch with, amidst the fog of Helen's illness and my subsequent quiet grief. We started a monthly poker game, just like old times. Over cards and beer, I shared a sanitized version of my story. They saw it as a tactical triumph. You always were 10 steps ahead on every project, Arthur. One of them, a man named George, chuckled. Should have known you'd have a contingency plan for this too. Their perspective helped frame the events not as a family tragedy, but as a complex problem that required a logical, albeit ruthless, solution. The emotional sting began to fade, replaced by a sense of pragmatic satisfaction. The world of my daughter and her husband seemed to shrink further and further away. I would occasionally hear whispers through my cousin Mark. They had struggled financially. Tom had apparently been counting on a promotion at his sales job that didn't materialize, and their lifestyle, built on the expectation of my imminent financial demise, was unsustainable. They had to sell Sarah's expensive SUV. There was a quiet justice in that, a balancing of the universal ledger. I took no pleasure in their hardship, but I felt no sympathy either. They had made a calculated business decision to treat me as a disposable asset, and their venture had failed. Their loss was simply the cost of doing business. The real joy came from the scholarship fund. At the end of the first academic year, I received a handwritten letter from the inaugural recipient. She wrote about her classes, about the thrill of working in the university's structural engineering lab. She said the scholarship had allowed her to focus on her studies without the constant burden of financial worry. "Because of you and your late wife," she wrote, "I can build my future." I placed her letter on my desk, next to the picture of the Harrison Bridge. It was a tangible result, a load-bearing beam in the new structure of my life. This was my real inheritance. Not something I received, but something I gave. It was an investment in the future, in a way that a house passed down through a resentful bloodline could never be. My trip to Spain was even better than the one to France. I spent a month tracing the path of ancient Roman engineering, marveling at the aqueducts of Segovia and the bridges that still stood 2,000 years after their construction. These were structures built by people who understood permanence. They built for empires, for centuries. It put my own small family drama into perspective. My life was a tiny sliver of time, but what I did with it, the principles I chose to live by, mattered. I chose to live like those Roman engineers. Build with integrity, ensure the foundations are deep and strong, and create things that will outlast you. On my 70th birthday, I didn't have a big party. I invited my cousin Mark and my friend George over to my condo. We opened a bottle of excellent scotch, sat on the balcony, and watched the city lights flicker on. There were no strained family obligations, no forced smiles, no underlying tensions. It was just genuine companionship. Mark raised his glass. "To Arthur," he said, "the man who designed his own masterpiece of a life." I smiled. He was right. I had become the architect of my own peace, the project manager of my own contentment. I had taken a situation designed to break me and used it as the catalyst to build something stronger and more authentic in its place. The past was a blueprint of a failed project, one I had learned from and filed away. The future was an open design, full of possibilities, and for the first time, I felt I had all the right materials to build it. As time went on, the story of what I had done became a quiet legend in my small circle. It wasn't something I boasted about, but the simple fact of my comfortable, independent life was a testament to the choices I had made. The narrative Sarah had tried to write, of the confused, incompetent old man, had been utterly erased and replaced by the reality of a man fully in command of his faculties and his future. My poker nights with my old engineering colleagues continued, a reliable source of camaraderie. During one game, my friend George, while contemplating a difficult hand, looked at me and said, "You know, Arthur, the thing about your situation with your daughter, it's a classic case of miscalculating the load capacity." I chuckled. "How so?" "She put too much weight on your sentimentality," he said, tossing a chip into the pot. "She assumed your love for her, and for Helen's memory, would be a weakness she could exploit. She never calculated that your sense of self-preservation, your own structural integrity, was the stronger material." He was right. It was the perfect engineering analogy. They had banked on my emotional foundation being weak, susceptible to the pressures of guilt and obligation. They never imagined that my core was made of something more resilient. I had spent a lifetime analyzing stress points and failure risks in concrete and steel. It turned out the principles were transferable to life itself. The peace I had found was not a passive state. It was an active one, maintained by the boundaries I had erected. I had no contact with Sarah, and I had made it clear through my lawyer and my cousin that I desired none. It wasn't about punishing her further. It was about protecting my own well-being. My home was a sanctuary, and I would not allow the toxicity to seep back in. I focused outward, on the things I could build. The scholarship fund was thriving. I had made some shrewd investments, and the principal had grown, allowing the foundation to offer a second scholarship the following year. I met with the university's financial aid director, a warm and capable woman who shared stories of the students my gift was helping. They were ambitious, bright, and grateful. They were the children I was now investing in, a legacy of merit rather than blood. One day, while at a coffee shop near my condo, I had an unexpected encounter. A young woman approached my table hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Arthur Jennings?" I confirmed that I was. "I'm Amelia," she said, her eyes bright. "I'm the first Jennings scholar." I was momentarily stunned. I stood up and shook her hand. She was poised and articulate, radiating a quiet intelligence. We talked for nearly an hour. She told me about her dream of designing sustainable water systems. She asked me about my career, about the bridges I had built. The conversation was invigorating, a true meeting of minds between generations. As we were about to leave, she said something that struck me deeply. "Mr. Jennings, what you did, it's not just about the money. It's knowing that someone believes in you. It's like you built a foundation for me to stand on. A foundation. There was that word again. It was the theme of this new chapter of my life. I had torn down a failing structure built on deceit and entitlement, and in its place I was now helping to build dozens of new ones. Strong foundations for the next generation of builders. When I returned to my quiet, orderly condo that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of rightness, of accounts being fully and finally settled. My life was my own. The assets I had spent a lifetime accumulating were being used for creation, not for funding a petty, materialistic fantasy. I had faced the ultimate stress test, and I had not broken. I had simply redesigned the project. The past was a closed book, a case study in failure analysis. The future was clear. I was a builder, and I still had a lot of building left to do.